I remember when the iPhone first came out, one of my friends got it first, and the way he explained it to me was, you'll never be bored again.
Well, let me just first reflect on your friend's comment because it's fascinating. And I think that the truth is that these devices have made us more bored than ever.
I'm Jon Favreau. Welcome to Offline. My guest today is Dr. Anna Lembke, professor of psychiatry at Stanford University and author of the New York Times bestseller, Dopamine Nation. Lembke argues that the internet, social media, and our phones are addictive in ways that are quite similar to drugs, alcohol, or tobacco. She even calls the smartphone the modern hypodermic needle and makes the case that constant access to things that flood our brains with dopamine, like shopping on the internet, watching YouTube, or scrolling through Twitter, are actually changing the way our brains process pleasure. Dr. Lembke cites skyrocketing rates of anxiety and depression as one consequence of our collective dopamine addiction, especially in wealthier nations where all this access to overabundance is actually causing us harm. Here's Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you for joining Offline.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So this is a show about all the ways the internet is breaking our brains and what we can do about that. You've written an outstanding New York Times bestseller called Dopamine Nation that argues the internet and social media are addictive in ways that are similar to things like alcohol, drugs, nicotine, sugar, because they're all screwing with our dopamine levels. For people who might not be familiar with dopamine, can you start by explaining what it is and how it works?
Sure. So dopamine is one of many neurotransmitters in our brain, and neurotransmitters are the molecules that communicate across the synapse. The synapse is the space between neurons, and neurons are the workhorse cell of our brain that conduct the electrical signals that create our thoughts, emotions, and everything. Dopamine is essential for the experience of reward, pleasure, and motivation. It's not the only neurotransmitter involved in that process, but it's probably the final common pathway for all reinforcing drugs and behaviors. Dopamine may be actually even more important for motivation than for the experience of pleasure itself, although it's involved in both of those processes. And there's a very famous experiment showing that if you engineer a rat to have no dopamine receptors in the reward circuit of the brain, if you put food in that rat's mouth, it will eat the food and get pleasure from the food. But if you put the food even a body length away, the rat will starve to death because it won't be motivated to get up and go get the food. Hence, dopamine is essential for not just the feeling of pleasure, but also the desire to go get the reward.
Well, so you're a psychiatrist.
Right.
What were you hearing from patients that led you to realize that dopamine was, or sort of our dopamine levels have become a problem, and ultimately write this book?
The first thing that I observed was that in patients who were addicted to drugs and alcohol, they were also almost uniformly very depressed and anxious. And when they were able to stop using drugs and alcohol for a long enough period of time, which on average was about a month, then they felt better in many different ways, but importantly, their mood improved and their anxiety went down without my having to do any other intervention in terms of like an antidepressant or an anxiolytic or some kind of psychotherapy. So that was very powerful for me because it demonstrated that just stopping the addictive substance alone could have this profound effect on a patient's mood and well-being. The corollary to that was through my career, I've also seen many patients with pain, physical pain, who have gotten addicted to opioids as a result of a doctor's prescription. And what I saw in those patients, for many of them, was that when they got off of opioids, their pain actually got better. So again, a profound corollary to this idea that when we repeatedly ingest highly reinforcing, that is to say addictive substances, in the moment they seem to relieve our pain, whether it's psychological pain or physical pain. But the cumulative effect over time is that they actually make pain worse. And that we don't see that because it's an insidious step-by-step process. But then we find ourselves in this place where we have more physical pain for patients with chronic pain on long-term opioids, have more psychological pain for patients, who are using any of those substances. So that's essentially what I've seen.
Can you explain a little about this link between pleasure and pain and the role that dopamine plays in that?
Sure. So one of the most important findings in neuroscience in the last 100 years or so is that pleasure and pain are co-located in the brain. So the same parts of the brain that process pleasure also process pain, and they work like opposite sides of a balance. So if you imagine that you have a beam on a central fulcrum, when we experience pleasure, it tips one way. When we experience pain, it tips the opposite way. And there are several rules governing this balance. And the first is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to pleasure or pain. And so with any deviation from that neutral position, our brains will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what neuroscientists call homeostasis. And they do that through a process called neuroadaptation. So for example, when we ingest an intoxicant, we get a release of dopamine in the brain's reward pathway, and our balance tilts to the side of pleasure. But no sooner has that happened than our brains will work to restore homeostasis by adapting to the increased level of dopamine, by downregulating our own dopamine production and transmission. I like to imagine that as these little neuroadaptation gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again. But the gremlins like it on the balance, so they don't get off as soon as we're level. They stay on until we're tilted an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain. And that's very important. We experience that subjectively as the come down, the after effect, the hangover. If it's subtle, we might not even notice it. It might be outside of our conscious awareness. But for every pleasure, we pay a price. The price is the equal and opposite of whatever the initial stimulus was. And that is how our brains ultimately then restore homeostasis. Now, what happens with addiction is that as we repeatedly expose our brains to the same or similar stimulus, we accumulate more and more neuroadaptation gremlins on the pain side of the balance until we've effectively changed our hedonic set point. Now we are walking around chronically with a balance tilted to the side of pain. Those gremlins are camped out there, and it takes a long time to reverse that process. So when we don't have our drug, we are in withdrawal. The universal symptoms of withdrawal from any addictive substance are anxiety, irritability, insomnia, dysphoria, and intrusive thoughts of our drug. Now we're needing to use our drug in greater and greater amounts, not to get high, but just to level the balance and feel normal. And when we try to stop using, we go into immediate withdrawal, and that can last a very long time, which is why people with addiction will relapse, even when, by every objective measure, they and others can see that their lives are better when they're not using. But subjectively, they are in pain. And that physiologic urge to restore the balance kind of supersedes everything else.
So what you're talking about, addiction, is something that humans have grappled with for centuries. But the argument in your book is interesting because basically you're saying that this is now a sort of societal issue because there are just so many more sources of addiction out there and there's such easier access. And you say that our brains are not evolved for this world of plenty. Why not? And what are they wired for?
Yeah, so this system of the pleasure-pain balance, where we have to feel the opposite of whatever the pleasure is before going back to level, is a genius type of wiring for a world of scarcity and ever-present danger, because it means whatever pleasure we find, it is fleeting, and in fact, we pay a price for it, and that pain is then driving us to continue to seek more of whatever we need to survive: food, clothing, shelter, which is exactly why we've been able to survive through millions of years of evolution, because the world has primarily been a world of scarcity. Over the last 200 years or so, we have completely transformed our world. Technology has created an incredible abundance, not just of our basic material things that we need to survive, but above and beyond that. Now everything is drugified in some way, whether it's food, human relationships, sex, shopping, you name it. We have not just our basic needs met, but we have increased potency, variety, quantity, and access to all kinds of reinforcing drugs and behaviors, which has made us all vulnerable to the problem of addiction, and furthermore, vulnerable to this problem of the pleasure-pain balance being reset to the side of pain, which I argue is the reason that we're seeing increased rates of mental illness and suicide, especially depression and anxiety.
And what's interesting about those increased rates of depression and anxiety is you point out that they're increasing even faster in the wealthiest nations. And you think there's a dopamine connection there. Can you explain what that is?
Yeah, so if you look at the epidemiologic data, it's very clear that the rates of depression, anxiety, suicide are going up, and they're going up fastest in rich nations. If you do measures or surveys, happiness surveys, the least happy people live in the richest countries in the world. And those trends are just continuing, which is paradoxical, right? You would think that as we have more and more material goods, more access to state-of-the-art health treatment, including mental health treatment, that we would all be more and more mentally well. And yet we're seeing the exact opposite. We've clearly reached some kind of tipping point where the overabundance is in fact causing us harm. And I argue that it's because of this sort of ancient wiring in the reward circuitry that I just described.
So it's basically because people in wealthy nations and wealthy people just have a lot more access and exposure to addictive substances, whether they be drugs, alcohol, sugar in foods, shopping, sex, all that other kind of stuff. That's probably why.
Well, I would say that is a big part of it, but it's not even just like that we have more access to addictive substances or things that you would clearly identify as addictive substances. It's that we also don't need to strive for anything, right? We don't. All of our survival needs are met. There's nothing that we need to work for, and we're also incredibly insulated from painful experiences. So, I mean, if you think about like how humans evolved, they lived in their bodies. They had to rely on their bodies to survive. And they had to tolerate a great deal of pain, right? Whether that was the pain of exertion to get food or the pain of living, against the natural forces or whatever it was. But we are completely disassociated from our bodies, where we spend all of our times in our head. We don't even have to talk about exerting ourselves. We don't even really have to get up off the couch. If we have any kind of physical pain, we can take a pill to eliminate it. In fact, we expect that we should not have pain, and that pain is dangerous, and that any type of pain is a mark of psychopathology, and that we need to medicate it or do something about it. So it's both the way in which we're insulated from pain and the way in which we don't need to strive for any of our survival needs. And on top of all of that, we have this smorgasbord of highly drugified substances and behaviors, including things that didn't even exist before, like social media and video games and online pornography. Plus, we have a lot more leisure time. We're living longer. We have more leisure time on any given day, as well as having more days in our lives. We have more disposable income, even among the poorest of the poor. So we talk a lot about the income gap, and of course there's a terrible income gap, and it's a tragedy. But even among the poorest of the poor, people have more disposable income for luxury goods than ever before, in the history of humanity.
And so, because we are chasing pleasure at all costs and trying to avoid pain at all costs, paradoxically, we're causing ourselves more pain, more anxiety, more depression because of this imbalance.
Yes, that's exactly right. Yeah.
Offline is brought to you by Blue Moon. So we used all of our greatest material for the first Blue Moon ad, the pre-roll. Mm-hmm. I don't know what there is left right now.
Just a delicious beer.
Love it. Have you still been drinking this whole during the last 30 minutes of the podcast?
You bet I have.
This episode's about dopamine addiction.
Yeah, I think Dan's doing a great job interviewing.
Blue Moon is truly one of a kind with its bold flavor, bright explosion of color, iconic orange slice ritual, and authentic roots being born in a ballpark. No matter where you are or who you're with, a Blue Moon guarantees a one-of-a-kind beer experience every time. Love Blue Moon. Drink it all the time. Drank it before they were generous sponsors of Offline, but
It's a great
now,
beer.
now it's just,
It's one of the world's great beers.
now there's an extra excuse.
You'll love the Blue Moon.
It isn't like other beers. It's one of a kind from its refreshing flavor with Valencia orange peel for a subtle sweetness and hints of coriander. Blue Moon Belgian White is one of a kind beer that's made brighter. It's carefully crafted and full flavored with refreshing notes and a smooth, creamy finish. Blue Moon isn't just another beer. It's a whole different experience. Break away from the same old beer. Blue Moon Belgian White is one of a kind every time. Get Blue Moon Belgian White, Light Sky, and Moon Haze delivered by visiting get.bluemoonbeer.com/offline to see your delivery options. That's get.bluemoonbeer.com/offline. Blue Moon made brighter. Celebrate responsibly. Blue Moon Brewing Company, Golden, Colorado Ale. Offline is brought to you by Truebill. Do you know why free trials renew without your consent? It's a goddamn scam.
Capitalism.
It's a business scam. Don't let greedy corporations pocket your money or contribute to inflation. Download Truebill to take control of your subscriptions. I just wanted to stick it to the econ nerds.
Got it, yeah.
Truebill is the new app that helps you identify and stop paying for subscriptions you don't need, want, or simply forgot about. On average, people save up to $720 per year with Truebill. Because companies make subscriptions hard to cancel, Truebill makes it incredibly simple. Just link your accounts and Truebill will cancel your unwanted subscriptions in one tap. And your Truebill concierge is there when you need them to cancel unwanted subscriptions so you don't have to. I love this. I had so many unwanted subscriptions just that I don't even remember that I signed up for.
Mm-hmm.
Just
You're
taking
still paying
money
for CNN Plus.
Tough hit.
and then Truebill just went in and canceled them all. Truebill's responsible for canceling CNN Plus.
Good for you.
They have over 2 million users and helped save them over $100 million, which is pretty good. Don't fall for subscription scams. Start canceling today at Truebill.com/offline. Go right now, Truebill.com/offline. It could save you thousands a year. Truebill.com/offline. Offline is brought to you by Future. Future believes that people motivate people, and having your own future coach isn't just the best approach, it's the only sustainable approach to your health and fitness. Future has built the most talented team of fitness coaches on the planet, and when you join Future, you get paired with the one that's right for you, your goals, and your experience. Think about all the things that would be ridiculous to teach yourself or to be an expert on without a mentor, a teacher, or a coach.
Flying a plane.
Oh, yeah. I would love everyone who flies a plane that I'm in to have
Yeah, you want to DIY.
at least a mentor, at the very least.
You need a Gabe. You don't meet a lot of Gabes.
You don't meet a lot of
It's a very
Gabes.
popular name. I Googled celebrities named Gabe. Like Gabe Kapler.
Gabe,
former
yeah.
Red Sox player.
And I don't know, he qualifies
It was
as
a very popular
celebrity.
name in 1905.
Anyway, Gabe.
Says this random
My
website.
Gabe is great. I call him My Gabe.
Yep.
He
MySpace.
tailors my workout plan to meet my goals. He balances consistency and motivation to set me up for long-term sustainable success. That's how I feel. And you know what? He gives me a little push every once in a while, and he gives me a little good job.
Crushes John's lats.
A lot of lat
Pecs.
work, a lot of pec work.
Doesn't skip leg day.
Don't skip and don't skip
Can't
those
skip
that,
leg day.
that glute work either.
Yeah, don't sleep
You're-
on the butt.
Your words. Lay your lips to God's ears or something.
What was
Future
that about
isn't-
butt and lips?
You heard me.
Future isn't a fancy piece of equipment. This isn't a get fit quick plan, and this isn't a YouTube video. With daily coaching and tailored workout plans, your future coach will support you through every step of your fitness
Has
journey.
Gabe still never mentioned these ads?
No,
It's genuinely offensive at this
and
point.
it's not even like he doesn't pay attention to politics. Or he was like the other day when the Supreme Court thing broke. He goes, "Oh, is that thing going to screw up your day? And you guys are going to have to record." And like he was very knowledgeable about what that situation might entail for us at Pod Save America, and
Yeah.
yet nothing about
All right,
me
well,
mentioned. Maybe he skips the ads.
Hope springs eternal. Don't
Maybe
do that.
don't skip the ads, Gabe. There's no risk to try Future, and right now you can get 50% off your first 3 months and cancel anytime during the first 30 days at tryfuture.com/crooked. That's tryfuture.com/crooked. So I'd like to focus in on the digital aspect of our dopamine addiction because that's what this show's all about. You've called the smartphone the modern day hypodermic needle. Is it really that bad?
I mean, I think so. So if the actual hypodermic syringe was invented in the 1850s, and when it was first invented, it was going to be the solution to the growing problem of morphine addiction in the United States. The idea was that if you took the morphine and you injected it directly into the venous system, people wouldn't get addicted. Of course, that turned out to be the opposite of true. And there are many, many anecdotes like that in the history of, technology. And I do think that the smartphone has accelerated the growing problem of addiction because of the 24/7 access. one of the big factors of what makes something addictive is quantity and frequency of how often we use it. If, again, you think about that pleasure-pain balance, it's probably okay if we indulge in intoxicants on occasion, as long as we leave enough time in between for the neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off and for homeostasis or baseline dopamine firing to be restored. But if as soon as our balance is tipped to the side of pain, we, instinctively want to get out of that place, we reach for more of our drug, and there it is, then naturally we're going to find ourselves much more quickly circling the drain that is, the problem of addiction. And in my own clinical practice, I saw an explosion in the early years of the 2000s. More and more people coming in with severe addiction to gambling, pornography, and really, the story was very common. It was like, well, I always kind of gambled, or I always kind of used a little bit of pornography, but it wasn't until I got this smartphone that things really got out of control.
Yeah, I thought it was so interesting that you made the point that the internet promotes compulsive overconsumption not merely by providing increased access to drugs old and new, but also by suggesting behaviors that otherwise may never have occurred to us. So are you saying that just being exposed to addictive substances and behaviors can actually make us more addictive?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, access is one of the biggest and underappreciated risk factors for addiction. So the risk factors basically can be grouped into three buckets: nature, nurture, and neighborhood. There's clearly an inherited component or vulnerability. The way we're raised matters. If we have parents who explicitly or implicitly condone substance use, that's going to affect our addiction risk. But neighborhood is huge, and neighborhood refers to this idea of, do you have access to this drug? Is it readily available? Can you get it easily? When you run out, can you get more? I mean, just think of a world in which you had the same access to cocaine as you do to TikTok. There would be a whole lot of people who would be severely addicted. And we already have a cocaine problem, but I mean, the analogizing that to TikTok, it's crazy. I mean, it's infinite, right? And the other part of that too is the suggestibility part. I mean, humans are very, very suggestible. There are certain temperaments that are less suggestible than others. Teenagers, though, are particularly that time of life, is one of high suggestibility, meaning that peer pressure has a larger effect. But we're all vulnerable to that. And when we see somebody else doing something, it suggests the idea to us, and then we want to do it. That's just human nature. And that's where social media, even separate from social media addiction or addiction to social media, but social media intersecting with addiction to traditional drugs, is really, really pernicious. Like, people making videos of themselves using a particular drug, and then other teenagers seeing that, or people seeing that and then thinking, well, I want to try that. So stuff like that.
So I'm sure there's some listeners right now thinking like, well, I'm not that addicted to my phone. You point out, though, that addiction is a spectrum disorder. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so it's clearly on a spectrum. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the 5th edition, actually made a big change to acknowledge that it's a spectrum disorder. Not everybody is equally addicted to whatever the drug is. Some people are a little bit addicted. Some people are a lot addicted, where they've lost everything as a result of their addiction. And then there's kind of this pre-addiction state where people are kind of engaging in compulsive overconsumption, but not necessarily meeting our threshold criteria for addiction. I will say that it's important to note that there's no blood test or brain scan to diagnose addiction. We based it on what we call phenomenology, or patterns of behavior. But I can tell you that the pattern of addiction to things like social media, video games, online pornography, etc., is identical to when people get addicted to drugs and alcohol. And it's kind of a progressive disease. So, we all start out a little bit addicted, and then some of us are able to kind of recognize it and self-correct. Those people probably don't have the disease of addiction or the innate extreme vulnerability, whereas others, once they get going on their drug of choice, will have a very, very difficult time both seeing it and stopping it, even once they do see it. And I think that's a core piece of addiction, is the loss of agency. Of course, ultimately, we all retain some agency, or most of us retain some agency. I can think of circumstances where all agency is lost, but agency is greatly diminished in the disease of addiction.
Agency is diminished. I think another issue is not knowing that you're addicted, right?
Yes,
I think that's particularly probably the case with internet consumption and social media. Like, I remember when the iPhone first came out, one of my friends got it first, and the way he explained it to me was, you'll never be bored again. And at the time, I thought that sounded great, that we'll never be bored again. And that's sort of how I used it, as like, I'm passing the time, I'm using my phone all the time, I'm not going to be bored. What do you think our inability to just be bored has done to us? What are the consequences of that?
Well, let me just first reflect on your friend's comment because it's fascinating. And I think that the truth is that these devices have made us more bored than ever. And again, because what's happened is now we've so overstimulated ourselves with these high dopamine stimuli that natural pleasures and natural rewards are no longer interesting to us. In fact, less and less becomes interesting. And that's what happens in addiction. Our focus slowly narrows down to that drug of choice. Other things lose their salience, and we become obsessively preoccupied with obtaining ever more potent forms of that particular drug. And so we get caught in this vortex, and when we don't have that particular feeling, we're beyond bored, we're devastated. So part of getting out of this vortex of compulsive overconsumption is, first of all, being able to tolerate the intense boredom that comes with the come down, because boredom is actually a very uncomfortable emotion. It's uncomfortable in a superficial sense. It's like, this is boring, I don't have anything to do. But it also opens up all kinds of deep existential questions like, what do I do with my time? Like, what is my life for? Why am I here? Why do I do this thing and not that thing? I mean, in interesting ways, COVID and sheltering in place, I think, kind of raised some of those questions for people as well. Just sort of like, wait, why was I doing that thing? But to get out of our cyclical kind of compulsive use of these drugs, we have to be able to sit with that intense kind of boredom until those neuroadaptation gremlins hop off, homeostasis is restored, baseline dopamine firing goes back to original levels, and then we're able to take joy in more modest rewards. Because really the truth is that anything can be interesting if you focus on it and immerse yourself in it and pay attention to it, even the most mundane task. And this is part of what we need to learn in recovery, not just people with severe addiction, but frankly, I think all of us who are in a way addicted to this crazy dopamine oversupply that we live in, we have to be able to recapture our joy in simple, modest pleasures.
What you said about boredom, I think, probably hit home for me more personally than anything else, because I find myself, I think, on my phone to avoid the times where I'm sitting at bed at night thinking about bigger questions of meaning and purpose and existence that sort of flood into your head when you're just by yourself. And it's like, okay, well, now I need to take something to fall asleep because I can't sit in bed like this. Right. When I wake up, I don't want to think about these things, so I'm just going to scroll through Twitter because that's going to be distracting. And you tell yourself, like, well, I'll distract myself with the news of the world and everything else, and I don't have to worry about this. I'll just keep going through. But the boredom thing is a real issue, and I feel like that's probably always been a struggle of humanity, but it might just be more difficult now because you have phones and internet and other digital distractions.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for sharing that. I think you're not alone. I think what you described, what you do, this kind of constantly distracting yourself so that you don't look at those deeper questions, is what all of us are doing to some degree or another. And in a way, it's so tragic because we've engineered this world that actually allows us to have leisure time to reflect on these deep moral questions. And instead of doing that, we're playing League of Legends, right? I mean, it's just so ironic, that given the opportunity to actually think about, again, what is our meaning and purpose? How should we be living in the world? How should we be engaging with one another? We're terrified of those questions, and we're just wanting to sort of titillate ourselves out of having to think about them.
I want to focus specifically on social media here, which seems to have even more addictive qualities than using your phone for something like texting. Why do you think social media specifically is so addictive?
Well, I mean, first of all, we are wired to make human connections. We're social creatures. We release dopamine when we make connections with other people. Being part of a tribe has helped us through evolution, helped us protect ourselves from predators, find mates, conserve scarce resources. So it's deeply baked into our DNA to want to make these connections. And we know that oxytocin, which is a love hormone, is released and binds to dopamine-releasing hormones, specifically in this reward pathway. So we get a little hit of dopamine when we make a human connection. So I think what social media has done is that it has removed the work that it has taken to make those human connections and distilled human connection down to just the reinforcing parts of it, and then made that very, very potent. So essentially turned human connection, which is healthy and adaptive, into a potential drug. And the features of that are, well, first of all, you don't have to go anywhere to meet people, so it's effortless. If it's boring, you don't have to tolerate like a less than interesting or let's say even challenging or distressing interaction. You can just swipe right or swipe left and find somebody else. These are often curated profiles and beautiful faces and flashing lights and images. We're rewarded for engaging and interacting with likes, with rankings, with confetti, with happy noises. The people who made these social media platforms have carefully studied it and quantified it and seen, engineered what keeps people on and then amplified those aspects of it. The alerts too are really interesting. So these are the teasers or the reminders or like the intrusive little thing that comes in and says, oh, you should check this out. You should check that out. We know from animal studies that if you train a rat to know that it will get cocaine once or shortly after it, hears a bell or sees a light, if you measure dopamine levels in that rat's brain, what you find is that dopamine levels go up just with seeing the light or just with hearing the bell. In other words, the conditioned cue itself is rewarding. But following that brief hit of dopamine with the light or the bell, there's actually a decrease in dopamine, not to baseline levels, but below baseline levels. That's the dopamine deficit state, the gremlins on the pain side of balance. So then we're in craving, right? And now once we're in the craving state, once our balance is tipped to the side of pain, we are very, very motivated to do whatever work is required to get the reward. And my colleague Rob Malenka, who's a neuroscientist, says that in his animal studies, the way that he defines whether or not an animal is addicted is how hard that animal is willing to work to get the reward. So what happens is we get a little alert, oh, you should check out, this video, and we get a little burst of dopamine, then we get a dopamine deficit state, and then it's like, a train could be coming, but it's like, I'm going to take the time here to go find that video. I must do that now, because it's just like, it's hardwired physiology.
I mean, your point about doing the work to make these social connections is so well taken, because I think one of the things I tell myself to justify all my time on Twitter is, I'm in politics, and so I'm like, well, these larger questions of meaning and purpose that we were just talking about, I'm trying to engage other people in those questions, and we're trying to have this debate about our purpose here and how we all live together and all that kind of stuff. But that's not really what's happening on social media, because it's not like we're all sitting together having these deep conversations that you would with people in real life, where you're arguing with each other and you're doing the work to build connections and figure out politics and all that kind of stuff, because you're just trying to make a statement, get the retweet, hit the like, and get those quick dopamine bursts.
Right, exactly right. So, what it becomes is really just a chase for dopamine. And the actual content that we are using to justify why we're there is really relegated to, a corner, because we can tell ourselves that's why we're there because of the argument or the debate or, the pros and cons of X, Y, or Z, but really it's about the hits. And one of the ways that we create intimacy with other people is to feel the same emotion at the same time that they're feeling it. Now imagine, including negative emotions like outrage, right? And
Right.
now on social media, you can have that experience not just with one other human being or even a small handful. Now you're having it with millions of human beings. So the potency of that experience is very, very intense, which is also a way in which it becomes drugified.
How has this explosion in the use of smartphones and social media changed how you treat patients?
It's really changed how I treat patients. 20 years ago, a patient would come in and say, I'm depressed, I'm anxious. I'd say, try this pill, try that pill, try some psychotherapy. I didn't even ask really about drug and alcohol use, and it didn't even occur to me that our engagement with these devices necessarily, although I think I really early on had kind of an intuitive sense that these devices were highly habit-forming and addictive. And now when a patient comes in wanting help for depression, anxiety, insomnia, poor concentration, whatever it is, one of the very first things I'll do is I'll screen for compulsive overuse of drugs, alcohol, and all kinds of digital devices. And if I find that that's a part of that person's daily practice, then the first thing that I will suggest is a dopamine fast to try to reset reward pathways. Because in the majority of my patients, when I do that, that intervention alone essentially alleviates most of the depression and anxiety that they came in for in the first place.
Today's episode is sponsored in part by Seeker, a new independent search engine that prioritizes transparency, choice, and control, streamlining your access to reliable information online. Just think, no more clickbait, no more hidden agendas, no more slanted search results favoring profits over people. No more spreading misinformation. Seeker helps users know before they click. Here's how it works. Each news article that comes up when you search has its own Seeker score, a rating that determines how reliable an article is based on the following criteria: subjectivity, clickbait, incoherence, and title exaggeration. The higher the article scores on these criteria, the lower the Seeker score. You can also filter your search results by their political leaning. So whether you're searching for something left, right, or center, Seeker makes it easy to get all sides of the story.
I set my Seeker setting to Josh Barrow. You know?
What'd you get?
So I
A lot of
Centrist scamp. It's a centrist scamp.
Centrist
a lot of
scamp.
complaints about liberals, a lot of Matt Iglesias content.
Yeah. It's a little tweener
I
content.
like that. With Seeker, you can finally start to feel good about what you read. To get started, visit Seeker.com/crooked so they know we sent you. That's SEEKR.com/crooked. Seek for yourself today, because transparency matters. Offline is brought to you by Dems. In 2021, Dems, the large cap stock exchange traded fund designed for Democrats, outperformed the S&P 500 index by 2.5% net of fees.
Eat shit, Standard & Poor's.
There's someone who wrote this.
I don't know.
Really putting the Poor's and Standard and Poor's,
Put a sentence
comparatively.
together before.
I caught that. Love it. That was funny.
Thank you.
Thank you. Dems has the highest 5 Globe sustainability rating given by Morningstar. They're also fossil fuel free. And you can now buy one share of Dems for less than $30. If you're listening to this thoughtful, insightful, funny podcast, you likely believe in progressive values. So do we. Nothing that funny about this podcast. That's why the Dems Fund only includes U.S. companies that overwhelmingly support Democratic causes and
I
candidates.
think it's funny that you host a pod about being offline.
So the premise is funny.
Fundamentally,
there's sort of like a meta humor to the whole thing. This way you can ensure your investments also align with your values.
Hey, you
Look
guys
for
should check out my new podcast. It's called Dunking. It's about my experience dunking basketballs. How do I
face right
dunk?
now,
How
love
does
it.
one dunk?
Look for the Dems ticker, that's DEMZ, wherever you invest, or visit dems.fund to learn more. Investing involves risk. Principal loss is possible. Carefully consider the fund's investment objectives, risk factors, charges, and expenses before investing. This and additional information can be found in the fund's prospectus, which may be obtained by visiting dems.fund. Please read the prospectus carefully before investing. Distributed by SEI Investments Distribution Company. Offline is brought to you by Magic Spoon. We're all trying to eat better, but a healthy breakfast doesn't have to be boring. Magic Spoon has the amazing flavors you love, but without all the bad stuff. And it's perfect as a midnight snack right before bed. 0 grams of sugar, 13 to 14 grams of protein, and only 4 net grams of carbs in each serving. Although Honey Nut flavor does have 1 gram of sugar for all you sticklers out there. Only 140 calories a serving. It's keto-friendly, gluten-free, grain-free, soy-free, and low-carb. You can build your own box, available flavors to build your very own custom bundle, or cocoa, fruity, frosted, peanut butter, cookies and cream, maple waffle, blueberry, cinnamon, plus the newly reformulated Honey Nut flavor that will now be added to Magic Spoon's permanent collection. Congratulations, Honey Nut flavor.
Delicious.
We love Magic Spoon. Eat it all the time. I could use a bowl right now.
I had it today. I'll have it later.
Perfect. Go to magicspoon.com.
Peanut butter is the best.
It is. It is. Go to magicspoon.com/cricket to grab a custom bundle of cereal and be sure to use our promo code cricket at checkout to save $5 off your order.
You know what my
Spoon is-
custom bundle is? It's 3 peanut butter, 1 cocoa.
Ooh,
Oh, okay.
that's good.
Because it makes a little cocoa in sometimes, for an evening treat.
Of
A
course.
little bundle of joy.
Of course. Magic Spoon's so confident in their product, it's backed with a 100% happiness guarantee. So if you don't like it for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember, get your next delicious bowl of guilt-free cereal at magicspoon.com/cricket and use the code CROOKED to save $5 off. Thank you, Magic Spoon, for sponsoring this episode. So I'm not a patient of yours, but I've already tried to use this interview to get some free counseling. But what is a dopamine fast like if I'm like addicted to my phone all the time? And of course, again, I tell myself, and with this is somewhat justified, that I need to be on my phone because I need to keep up with the news because I do 2 podcasts about the news. So I need to keep up with the news. I need to be on my phone, but it does feel, it definitely got worse during the pandemic. It's one of the reasons I started this show. I'm just on my phone too much.
Yeah.
What does a dopamine fast look like for someone like me?
Well, for someone like you, who it sounds like you're kind of the average consumer at this point and not somebody with a full-blown addiction. I want to really emphasize that when I use that word addiction, it's somebody who's had serious life consequences as a result of their use. And so that can look things like profound depression, profound anxiety, inability to function in their major societal role, thoughts of suicide. In that context, the severe addiction, and I see that. So let me just emphasize, I see people with they're suicidal because of their online gaming disorder, because of their pornography addiction, because of social media engagement. And for those individuals, what it really takes is putting all screens away for a month. And why a month? Because a month is usually the average amount of time it takes to reset reward pathways. I always warn patients they're going to feel worse before they feel better. Those first 2 weeks are especially horrible as they go into withdrawal. But as the gremlins start to hop off and homeostasis is restored by weeks 3 and 4, the sun comes out for people and people will say, I feel so much less anxious, and then it becomes, how are we going to reintegrate this device if we are, back into your life, and very specific what that will look like. Now, what I've learned, since the publication of the book is that many people either can't or are unwilling to do that because they need to be engaged with these devices for their jobs. So then what I suggest is that you find the category of online behavior that you feel is unhealthy for you. The online behavior that once you start, it's difficult for you to stop. And or you find that you feel worse after doing it. So it somehow changes your subjective dopamine state so that you're more depressed and anxious as a result. And then you take that thing, whether maybe it's Twitter, maybe it's Facebook, maybe it's Instagram, maybe it's Snapchat, who knows? And you eliminate that for a month. I think that's probably, the recommendation that I would have for someone like you, and that you can plan that in advance, right? You can let people know I'm not going to be on Twitter for this amount of time. You can communicate to me in this other way. You can plan for other ways that you'll get your news by reading maybe long-form journalism, which will give you the opportunity to compare and contrast how much knowledge you actually acquire from Twitter versus other forms of getting your news. And my experience has been, I feel like I'm ultimately a lot better informed than many people who are getting their news from social media, because it's not really the best source ultimately. That's kind of what I recommend. There's also a mini fast that people can try where they literally put all devices and screens away for 24 hours. It's amazing how anxious that makes people. Just the thought of it's almost like being like they're going to be, blind and unable to grope their way through a 24-hour period without their phone. But I think that can be an instructive experience. It's not enough time to reset reward pathways, but it's enough time to recognize how addicted we've all become.
You talk a lot about balance as a solution. Do you think a healthy use of social media is possible?
I think it is possible, but I do think that it must start with the dopamine fast to reset reward pathways. A lot of times patients will ask me, well, can't I just slowly decrease? The problem with that is that then you never reset reward pathways, so you never regain the salience in other more modest rewards, and you also don't get the opportunity to see true cause and effect. It's not until we get some distance from our drug that we're able to really look back and say, wow, that's crazy that I put that much time and effort into using, that substance or doing that behavior online. Like, I don't even really recognize myself. So I think it starts with a fast and then a very detailed plan of, okay, how am I going to reintegrate this into my life? I'm going to make sure that when I wake up in the morning, I first exercise, get ready, do my I call quehaceres because my kids are in Spanish immersion. But the things I need to do, my to-do list, eat a healthy breakfast, clean up, make my bed, whatever my morning, sort of wellness practices are, and only then am I going to go to my device and turn it on. And before I turn it on, I'm going to actually make a list of the things that I'm going to do on my device. Now that list might actually include some YouTube surfing, but I'm going to be aware that when I'm doing that, I'm doing that. I'm not going to sneak it in between. And then when I'm not using the device, I'm actually going to power it down. I'm going to turn it off and put it in my bag. Right? There's almost this sense of once we've sent a missive out, there's a part of our brain that's mentally preoccupied with it coming back in. And it's just really amazing to me how we're always a little bit disengaged from what we're doing because we're thinking about our phones. But if you turn the thing off, you don't send anything out, so you're not expecting a return, and you turn it off, you can put it away for a while. And that's very, very liberating. So just a lot of little tricks like that. I mean, my patients have come up with a million amazing, ways that they've learned to kind of interact with these devices, but in a way that preserves their agency and allows them to balance or moderate their use.
The last lesson you had in the book was my favorite. You said, instead of running away from the world, we can find escape by immersing ourselves in it. Why does that work? Can you talk about that?
Well, I mean, I've spent a lot of my life, running away from painful things, only to find out that they always outrun me. So no matter how hard we try to pretend like those things are not there, or tell ourselves stories that, rework a narrative, at the end of the day, the truth will find us. So ultimately, it's better just to stop trying to distract ourselves, turn and face it, and just tolerate it, examine it, dive deep into it, wonder about it, sit with it. And recognize, too, that we're not alone in our suffering, that life is hard, that no matter who you are, I mean, I think people can look at other people's lives and think, oh, they have it all, or that person's got it all together. Everybody suffers. Everybody questions. Everybody struggles. We're not alone in our suffering. So I think that's important to recognize that and take comfort in that, kind of normalize sadness and even some degree of despair, and just remember that those feelings will pass. We won't, when we're in those states, we feel as if they're going to last forever, but in fact they never do. Nothing lasts forever, not even our misery.
And it sounds like that's also a way to give ourselves more lasting, deeper pleasure than just sort of chasing the quick dopamine hits.
Right. So one of the recommendations in my book is basically, instead of constantly pressing on the pleasure side and getting those gremlins on the pain side, if we intentionally press on the pain side by doing things that are mentally and physically challenging, the gremlins will actually hop on the pleasure side. This is the science of hormesis, which is Greek for to set in motion. And it turns out that mild to moderate noxious stimuli actually upregulate dopamine production and other feel-good neurotransmitters. So by kind of simulating a world that doesn't exist anymore, that is to say, simulating hardship, we can reset our dopamine reward pathway to the side of pleasure.
Last two questions I'm asking all of our guests. What were you doing the last time you realized you needed to put your phone down? And what is your favorite way to unplug?
Oh, gosh. Well, I actually don't really use a smartphone.
Wow.
I had to get, I had to get one a couple of years ago so that I could prescribe medicines. But other than that, I don't use my phone. But I'm vulnerable to YouTube surfing. And probably the last time I can remember, I'll get on YouTube and I'll just like be watching inane videos. And what I'll do is I'll refresh the YouTube button because I want to see what YouTube offers me. It's like almost like an old friend. Like what is my friend YouTube thinking that I should watch today? I mean, I'm drawn in by that. You know, the way that someone might suggest a book because they know you. I mean, I know it's terrible, but and I have to say I've been watching the Johnny Depp Amber Heard trial. And saying to myself,
I had a friend who was doing the same thing and telling me about that.
Why am I watching this? Why am I watching this? But there it is. And how do I get off? I often will call out to a family member, can you please come help me turn this off? I cannot get off. Come and help me shut down the computer. So
I love that. That's a great way to unplug. Asking someone for help doing it.
Yeah.
Dr. Anna Lembke, thank you so much for joining Offline and for all the wonderful advice. Really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me, and thanks for a great conversation.